To introduce our next speaker, Teun van Dijk, who in fact needs no introduction. He is a professor of discourse studies at the Pompeu Fabra University, Barcelona. He also holds 2 honorary doctorates. He has authored and edited a large number of books, including Communicating Racism, Elite Discourses on Racism, Discourse and Power, Society and Discourse, How Social Context Control Text and Talk, works that had formative influence on the work of many people, including myself. He is also the founder or editor of several academic journals. He will give a talk on discourse and discrimination in the media. Professor Van Dijk.
Does it work? Yes. Merhaba. Merhaba. I'm so glad that I am back here again in Istanbul. I'm especially grateful for the Hrant Dink Foundation and my friends, and especially Melissa, who has organized most of these meetings this week. And I'm very glad that I can talk about a topic which is part of the kind of work I've been doing now for more than 30 years in many countries, especially beginning in Holland, then in Spain, Latin America, and other countries in Western Europe. I am a discourse analyst. That means that I'm interested in text and talk, and specifically, I am what they call a critical discourse analyst. And a critical discourse analyst is interested in power and power abuse. A critical discourse analysis is interested in domination. A critical discourse analysis wants to find out how discourse, written or spoken, contributes to the reproduction of domination in society. And I think when we talk about racism, nationalism, sexism, classism, and so on, poverty, social disequality, social inequality, then I think it's extremely important that discourse plays a very fundamental role in the reproduction of these forms of domination. So if we talk about racism, what I would like to do in this half hour is to explain the basic framework which, according to my view and of many others, explain how racist domination is produced and reproduced in society through discourse, in the mass media, political discourse, educational discourse, and many other forms of public discourse. And I would like to begin where my friend Charles Husband, from whom I learned of his 74 book with his colleague Hartman, and then many other books he has written about racism, because I started later, only in the 1980s, when I started to do the way people in Holland speak about ethnic minorities, and specifically immigrants, and specifically also Turkish people. And I wanted to know what they say about Turkish and Moroccan immigrants, and how they say it, and why they say it. So there were 3 aims of this research for many ways. I first wanted to know, as a linguist, what is this discourse about minorities? And all of you can, what I'm saying about Holland and Spain and Latin America and other countries, you can easily translate to Turkey. I don't know enough about Turkey to talk for you, but you can apply it yourself. So what I was interested in these many projects I have been doing since the early 1980s, my first aim was, I want to know, if people speak about others, what do they say? What is the structure of this kind of dominant discourse? At all levels of discourse. And later I will tell you what kind of levels I was studying. The second aim of this research was, if people talk in that way, it's not just talk. They not only talk in this way about ethnic minorities, immigrants, and so on, but also think in this way. So whereas the first aim was to systematically study different kinds of text and talk, my second aim was all the cognitive, mental, and other structures of the mind which somehow are at the basis of this kind of discourse. And the third aim, so where the first aim is discursive, or discourse or linguistic if you like, the second aim was more cognitive. The third major aim is, what is the social function of that particular kind of talk in society? Why do people talk in this way anyway? Why is that so? What is the role of this dominant discourse and its structures and these dominant ways of thinking upon society? It has to, obviously to do with power. I think when I start with this very general framework, I would like to start with one of the keywords which we have been using this week in several meetings, and also was an important part of Charlie's presentation, namely the notion of hate speech, which is being used in many countries, also here, and I think is the wrong term. And I'm going to try to convince you to forget about it. Not that I'm saying there is no hate or no hate speech. There is. But it gives the wrong emphasis. It gives the wrong emphasis, and it emphasizes hate. And it means that you emphasize emotions. You emphasize something which is just personal. Well, one of the things I have found after more than 30 years of studying racism is, with a phrase you always know from American movies, it's nothing personal, baby. Racism is nothing personal. Racism has to do with groups of people. It has to do with power relations between dominant groups and dominated groups, and the same is true for sexism. It's nothing personal, baby. Racism has to do with domination. It has to do with the reproduction of domination in society, and discourse has a crucial role in that form of reproduction of domination. So if I define racism, and you can substitute racism also for sexism and nationalism, all forms of other forms of domination and social inequality, then somehow it has to do with control. Power I define in terms of control. And it means that if you have power over other groups, you can control what they do and cannot do. You limit their freedom. They can no longer enter your country if they like. They can no longer enter your neighborhood if they like, your club. And they cannot either enter your newspaper if they like. Somehow it limits the freedom of people when a dominant group controls other people. So power, very importantly, controls the movement and the freedom of people, what they can do and not do. That's very important. So one group dominates another group if they have this particular kind of power of limiting their freedom. And one of the important things is of a system of domination, it's not just a question of limiting the social practices of someone, that they can no longer do what they like. It also has to do, again, with the mind. That's why sometimes my method people describe as socio-cognitive. It has to do with social structures and power and domination. But it's not just that. It is not just there to see in manifest public acts of discrimination. We all know you can no longer enter the country or a room or a club or a family because you are black or a woman or because you are part of a minority and so on. It is not just a question of observable acts of discrimination, it's also here. Racism, sexism, and other forms of domination are also somehow mental representations, and you know what we call them, and Charlie mentioned many of them. We talk about stereotypes, prejudice, ideologies, and so on. So you should see, in my view, that if you talk about any kind of form of domination, it has to be analyzed at these two levels. forms, systematic forms of discrimination and systematic forms of different thinking about other people. That somehow, not only in your obvious actions, but also in your mind, you make a distinction, which Charlie also emphasized from social psychology, between us and them, between in-groups and out-groups. That's very fundamental. As soon as you see someone else, not just as another person, but as a member of another group, then you already engage in this kind of group thinking. All right, so that's very important. Now, this is classical social psychology, and from my point of view as a discourse analyst, I want to make a special contribution to this very general study about intergroup conflict, domination, power, racism, sexism, and so on. I want to emphasize that discourse has a very fundamental role in this whole system. Why is that? For two reasons. Discourse is itself also a form of social practice, like any other. So you can discriminate against people by treating them in a negative way, and ultimately even by killing them. That is the obvious manifestation of the system of racism or nationalism or whatever it is. That's what you see. But also, at the level of the mental representations people have, that somehow is already be prepared. It is something which is in the structure of thinking and discourse, where the question is not only that discourse itself is a social practice and you can also discriminate people by talking in different ways about them. So discourse itself can also be a discriminatory practice like any other one, excluding people, problematizing people, and derogating people. You know, you do that like any other social practice also by discourse. And now discourse has another very fundamental function, that is a mediating function between the mind and social practices. How do we get these prejudices? How do we get these stereotypes and these racist or sexist ideologies here in our minds in the first place? We are not born with them. Racist ideologies, sexist ideologies are learned. They are acquired and they are learned mostly by discourse. Discourse is the way we, from very small, from our parents, television, books, then the newspapers and so on, we learn discrimination, we learn racism and sexism through mostly public forms of discourse. Mostly when you are an adult, from the newspaper, television, the social media. It is the kind of discourse which surrounds us all the time. Most of the kind of social practices all of you as students and professors engage in are forms of discourse, text and talk. That's most of what you do as intellectuals. We deal with discourse all the time. But also other people who are maybe not intellectuals also most of the time talk, watch television, read newspapers and so on, engage in all kinds of... So we are sort of embedded in a massive environment of discourse, and it is this massive environment of discourse where we from small learn to be sexist, racist and so on. Happily, and that's the good news at least, we also learn in this way to be anti-sexist and feminist and so on, because no one is born a feminist. No one is born an anti-racist. You have to learn that in the same way. You learn it again by all kinds of social practices, like doing your share in the household for a man, for example, but also you learn it by doing and engaging in all kinds of talk, listening and reading to talk. Now, that is the essential thing. So if racism would be just a question of hate, it would be just a personal thing. The problem is that if we look at those who are specifically responsible for these public discourses, those are the kind of people I call the symbolic elites. Those who are involved and responsible for the mass media, political discourse, and discourse of education. Are they ordinary people from the street who just say something negative about immigrants? No. These are people who have power. They have very large amounts of discursive power. They have access to kinds of public discourse many of us don't have. They have access to political discourse in parliament many of us don't have. They do have access to the mass media, but only few people do have active access to the media. And very few people have access to writing textbooks. So those people who are responsible for public discourse are mostly what I call the symbolic elites, those who are in control, symbolic representation in society. Now that is the basic theory I have been working on for many years. Now let me specify this a little bit for today. If you would identify racism with hate of people, then the idea would be that all these directors of public speech, politicians, teachers, professors, journalists are constantly hating other people. There's no such thing. I think that it would be wrong to reduce racism and sexism to a question of individual hate. And individual hate has to do with our bodies. People today would talk about an embodied experience. It has to do with excitement and so on. And most of the time that's not so. When an editor admits an article in a newspaper against immigrants, for example, you think he is excited and hating? No. He takes very clear decisions about what he wants to produce. It may be extremely rational. What he wants through his mass media and what the political person talking in parliament wants is not express his or her hatred. What he wants is to make sure that no immigrants come into the country or that immigrants don't get this particular kind of rights. He wants to keep in charge. He wants to produce and reproduce the kind of power in society which he and his own people have. That is what racism is all about. What sexism is all about. Sexism has to do with power. Racism has to do with power. So this particular kind of public discourse, what kind of function does it have? It has the function to produce and reproduce power in society. That is what racism and sexism and classism is all about, in my view. Now that is collective. It has to do with groups and in-groups and out-groups. That does not mean that individual people in some situations, specific kind of contexts, are not hating and committing hateful crimes, of course. But that is not specifically ideologies, attitudes, prejudices, again, are not personal, they are collective. They are typically forms of social cognition, not personal cognition. They are forms of social cognition. They are shared by groups of people. They're shared by groups of people. It's a collective phenomenon, as we already know from people in France like Durkheim, like Moscovici, and so on. And the same for the school of Tachful, which Charlie mentioned. I mean, in social psychology, we deal with social representation and social cognition. That is what prejudice and racism, prejudice and ideologies are all about. Now, how does this affect personal people, individuals? First of all, because individuals are members of these groups. They have to learn these particular kind of ideologies. And these particular kind of ideologies, they somehow also may affect them in specific situations. So if you are out of a job, what happens all the time, and then somehow you read in this public discourse that maybe the immigrants or the minorities are to blame, then in that particular situation of your particular personal situation, yes, then you may suddenly be very angry against your Turkish or Moroccan or Pakistani neighbor, yes. But that's a contextual, personal situation. It's not a general kind of thing. No one, again, is born racist. No one spontaneously becomes anti-Turkish, anti-Moroccan or anti-Pakistani in Western Europe. No one in this country spontaneously becomes anti-Armenian or anti-Jewish. It is something you learn from public discourse and from public cognition. That's crucial. But once you have learned this collective thing and you're a member of that particular kind of group, then yes, when you are in a specific personal situation where you may somehow blame others, then it's very easy when the government or the newspapers and so on have blamed the others for many other things collectively, then you may also blame your particular personal situation to the other immigrant people and so on, or minorities, and then that might be associated with hatred. Those of you who know about psychology know that the last 30 years, also my own work, we have been using this notion of mental model very often. A mental model is personal. That is really personal. A mental model is a representation of one single event. So when you read in the newspaper about yesterday, this Armenian person has done so-and-so, you construe a personal mental model of that situation. That's your own interpretation of the situation, a personal interpretation of a personal situation. That is a mental model. Each of you have different mental models of each of these kind of things. And the interesting thing of mental models, because they're personal, they are not just collective. They are applied to your specific personal situation. And there, yes, you do have emotions and evaluations. You may, in that particular kind of mental model, have some kind of emotion like anger or hate or envy and many other kind of things. So if you want to relate all these big ideologies, racist ideologies, sexist ideologies, through all these specific kinds of attitudes people have, for example, about immigration or about abortion or about other big issues in each country, and you want to relate these to particular kind of personal experiences, you do that through what we call a mental model. So each person and each situation dealing with immigrants, minorities, and so on, they construe a mental model. And there you might sometimes find hatred. And then, yes, hate speech is a manifestation of a mental model where you have this particular kind of emotion. But that's not the rule for the whole group. Because most of the time, the people who are in charge of these public media, are they permanently excited or hating? I don't think so. I think in a very rational way, they produce and reproduce their power and want to stay in charge. They don't want to share power with other people, like men who are in charge of a company and don't want to admit women, as we now see in the European community, where our democratic countries, England, Holland, my own country, and Germany, central countries in Western Europe, do not want to admit that in big companies, for example, women have no say and only are maybe for 2 or 3 or 10 or 15% in the board of directors of these companies. And they don't want, as the European Commission wants, that they will eventually be 40% in these board of directors. And the major, powerful, rich countries of the European Union don't want this kind of percentage. Why not? Because it's bad for business, they say. No, it has to do with power, because those are in front of the business. They won't share their power and other kinds of benefits with people who are not like them, women, and so on. Now, this kind of example you can find everywhere. Now, let me just give you 3, focusing on the mass media. I give you 3 main dimensions of doing systematic analysis each of you can do. Each of you who has studied mass media communication knows that traditionally we make a distinction between production of media, news, and so on and so on. Then the message, as they say, itself, discourse and talk, any kind of mass media, and of course it's a fact. So 3 dimensions. Let me just maintain this very traditional, old-fashioned distinction. So the first kind of thing we study is how is news produced in a newspaper and television? How? Do people just walk the street and then observe the world and write news? No, news is not produced in that way. Journalists go to very specific places where they are guaranteed to have some kind of news. So they go to very specific kind of institutions always, like the government, parliament, the police, laboratories, universities, and people where they have systematic and organized way of relating themselves with the mass media. They have, for example, a publication department or a press department, and these press departments produce systematic, each day systematically they produce press releases. The newspaper is full of things which are already pre-cooked by other people. A journalist, when he or she writes a news article, is doing that on the basis of other texts, source texts. So what they basically do is they get all kinds of sources, they press releases, telephone calls, internet sources, and so on. They just combine these kind of things and they write a news article on the basis of text produced by other people. The question now is, who writes these source texts? All right? Now, if that, for example, if we have a conflict in Western Europe or here, an ethnic conflict with a minority group, you think they're going to ask the representatives of the minority group? No. They usually go and ask for the dominant organizations, the important politicians or the important lawyers or the important professors and so on, those of our own group who have something to say. Our own people in mass communication are always considered to be more reliable than the others. Other people are usually not be trusted to have an independent voice in our newspaper. Those who have a voice are those of us who are being trusted as being reliable. Other people of other groups, minority groups, immigrants, and so on, are basically always seen as being biased. They cannot be objective and trusted to give objective information about an ethnic conflict. We, and each country, you have to say who in what country it is, we are always those who are assumed to be objective. So as you can imagine, if the selection of the source text is already biased and goes typically to our people, our dominant group people, our institutions, our authorities, then obviously the others have very little to say. So that's the first dimension. There is already a systematic bias in the control of who can say what. I'll give you an example. Years ago, with my students in Amsterdam, I did a study, some of you may have seen, for a book called News as Discourse. It's about systematic analysis of how news is produced and its structures and so on. And one of the things I did was fieldwork with my students, and I wanted to know where the journalists got their information from. Where, what, how, you know, with whom they did phone call, what kind of information they use from dictionaries, with whom they have interviews, and so on, the systematic study of this kind of thing. And I noticed, because in parallel I was interested in questions of racism and racism in the mass media, but it was independent. And we saw that when there were press releases of immigrant and minority groups, where did the press release go? To the waste paper basket. They were not found to be interesting, reliable, and objective, and so on. So systematically, specific kind of sources are being discriminated from the start. So here we have an actual notion of discrimination. It's a practice. It's a routine practice of the mass media not to include the information of press releases of immigrants and minorities. So first one of discrimination. Second, a very crucial notion also in news production has to do with access. Who has access to the media? Who can speak? Charlie already mentioned that specific kind of people have no voice. It means they are not even asked. They are not even being accessed. They are not being interviewed, even when it concerns them. Even when a Turkish sociologist in Holland who would be an expert to explain something, he or she would not be asked only because he or she is Turkish, and because he probably or she probably has a biased view of some kind of ethnic conflict. So they have less access. So if you want to explain racism and so on, what I propose is not to think primarily of these cases of hatred and so on, but to think of something much more systematic which has to do with power, with excluding people from a specific kind of situation, and it is being done without any kind of emotion. It is being done very coolly and very rationally in order to produce, and it's a form of, it's even a natural way of maintaining power. It's not even always deliberate. It's not something like we have some kind of conspiracy to keep other people out. It is something which is very natural, that you want to maintain power, and so you don't listen to people who are different from yourself. That's the question of access and limitation of sources of other groups. That's the one thing. Second, the mass media the mass media messages themselves, text and talk, television, newspapers and so on. What do you see there? What you see there is a manifestation of the underlying ideologies. So if it is, for example, a racist ideology, and if I say that power has to do with us and them, it has to do with some kind of polarization. And what you find in the structure of ideologies, and those of you who want to read more, I wrote a book about this 10 years ago on ideology, and you'll find details about it. I'll give you a summary in a few words. An ideology has an internal structure. It's not just a mass of ideas or views. An ideology is somehow a mental representation which is of the basis of our groupness. We men, we women, we Turkish, we Armenians, we Jews, etc., and also others. So ideologies have to do with the fundamental notions of being members of a group. And it is what we all have in common, what we slowly learn. It takes a lot of, it's like learning a language. You don't learn an ideology overnight. You also don't unlearn it. It takes a lot of time to become a feminist. It takes a lot of time to become a socialist or a liberal or whatever. It takes many years. So you can not, for example, one day be a feminist and next day you have another. No. There's things which stay with you for a long time. Not forever, but you can change ideologies, but it's for a long time. Now, an ideology has a fundamental structure of polarization between us and them. It typically is emphasizing our good things, how progressive and modern and tolerant and democratic we are. That's what we are. And the others in each country for different kind of values are typically on the negative side. So those who don't want to work, or they're criminal, or whatever. They cannot be trusted. They are not reliable. Many of the negative things are attributed to the other group. Now that is what the basic ideology is all about. And this being more specific and specific kind of attitudes. For example, attitudes about free speech, or attitudes about immigration, or specific issues which are also still social, and finally this also shows up in the individual mental models of the people, so that each journalist with this particular kind of ideology will write a newspaper article under the control of that particular kind of polarized ideology. So what do you find in a message which we call today hate speech, and which I prefer to call discriminatory discourse? You find a polarization between us and them at all levels of discourse. And we have no time to elaborate it, but all levels of discourse, beginning with the topics. You find emphasizing our good things and emphasizing their bad things. So typically in articles in Western Europe about asylum seekers, immigrants, minorities, and so on, you find emphasizing that somehow they are a problem for our society, that somehow we cannot afford them, that somehow they are more criminal than us, somehow they are abusing of our social services. They are, people who simply don't want to work and just want to have our social benefits. We have all different kind of topics which are being emphasized, and typically so, immigration itself is defined as a problem. And then if they are finally in our country, the next major problem they cause for us is they don't want to integrate. They are so different. They are typically, for example, Muslims in Western Europe. And in other countries, there may be other different kind of cultural differences. They don't want to learn our language. Much of the data I have, people say, they don't want to learn Dutch, or they don't want to learn Spanish. This kind of thing. They don't want to learn our language is one of these typical complaints people have in this particular kind of discourse in the mass media, in television, everyday conversations, and so on. So that's a third thing. And interestingly, this emphasizing the bad things of them. They are no good. They are a threat. They are different from us. They don't want to learn the language. And many other negative things according to our norms and values of the dominant group. But there's also something else very important. It's not just that in this ideological discourse you emphasize the negative things of them, but also de-emphasize, mitigate, excuse, deny our bad things. So what you also find, many of the things which have to do with immigration, minorities in each country, also here, has to do with discrimination, prejudice, violence, criminality, and so on. These particular kind of things of our own group are being disemphasized. So if we are prejudiced and racist, you think that's a major topic in the newspaper when we talk about immigrant? No. You find among thousands of articles which emphasize the negative things of them, you barely find systematic articles talking about our racism in detail, with good examples. In our newspapers in Holland, in Spain, and so on, yes, they talk about racism. You know where? In other countries. So there's much more about Le Front National in France than, you know, in Spain about our racist groups, and Holland the same. We talk much more about Haider in Austria than about the right-wing groups in our country, and they were also never called racist. Somehow, even the word racist is being avoided. So it's not only at the level of topics, the specific kinds of things are being mitigated, it's also at the level of words. It is simply using euphemisms. So use euphemisms at the level of the lexicon of the language. You have ways of mitigating our things. For example, instead of using racism, the newspaper sometimes uses things like popular discontent. Sounds nearly democratic. So, you know, so at all levels of discourse, the topics where they talk about and do not talk about our racism, there is not much information. At the level of words also, we have ways of emphasizing their bad things. So if people come into the country with our papers, how many newspapers will call these people illegals? So illegality is somehow not having papers. It's somehow associated with breaking the law, with criminality. The fact that they don't have papers which have nothing to do with them, they are being branded as illegals. So that's one way of doing things. And I give two other examples. One you already know. If they don't have access to the making of the news, it's obvious that they also are never cited, or very little. So if there is a conflict in Holland with the Turkish community or the Moroccan community, and they don't have access, their leaders don't have access, what you usually find is that they are not cited at all. Or maybe, yes, one extremist member of them to make a bad impression of the Turkish community. That happens, for example, in the United States, where they sometimes mention or quote a very radical black person as an example of, look, what the strange opinions they have. So if they cite you, it is because you're ridiculous or somehow. So this is the question of citation. And another final thing is metaphors. Metaphors are very strong everywhere. So if you want to somehow reach the mental models of people, because everyone who reads an article in a newspaper construes a mental model, his or her own interpretation, the mental model of that. Now how can you emphasize this emotional impact? Metaphors are great. Metaphors, according to modern metaphor theory, which is very popular in psychology and many other domains, modern metaphor theory of Schenck of George Lakoff and many other people, emphasizing the embodied nature of metaphors. And embodied means that somehow you feel them, not only you understand them, but you feel them with your whole body. It is translating something abstract, like immigration is a very abstract kind of thing. You cannot see or touch immigration. But if instead of talking about massive immigration you use waves of immigrants or invasion of immigrants, and waves is something in which you drown. And this feeling of drowning in immigrants is a very powerful, embodied way of understanding metaphors and discourse. All right, so metaphors are very powerful. So if you read the newspapers in Spain of a few hundred people coming from Africa and want to entry in the enclaves in Morocco of Melilla and Ceuta, the Spanish newspaper will typically use words like invasion. An invasion is like a foreign army coming and, you know, threatening our country, although there may be 10 or 20 people. So invasion, waves, and other kind of metaphors are very powerful to have this particular kind of effect. And finally, because there's no time. So you have discrimination in the production, in not having equal access to the newspaper and equal access to journalists, and journalists not actively asking people and giving them a way of giving their opinion. You have systematic discrimination in specific kind of ways of describing others in a very different way from describing us. That's what you call simply discursive discrimination. The second thing, if the mass media or any other kind of public discourse, I have no time to talk about textbooks, which is also very important. The things we read about textbooks. What I did several studies both in Holland and other countries about what they say about immigrants and minorities in textbooks. And you know about it, and I was here on another occasion talking about textbooks also here in Turkey, and it was interesting to see how in Turkey and Holland and in Latin America, many of the countries where they talk about minorities or immigrants, the representation of minorities generally is negative, unless it's far in the past. So Mapuches in Chile, for example, in the past were described as valiant warriors. Now they're described as terrorists. In the same way, the Arabic legacy in Spain is admired when they construed the Alhambra in Granada and other kinds of important things. But when they talk now about Moroccans and so on, it's a totally different kind of ball game. So in the past they're fine. Now they are not fine. So this is the kind of thing you find in discourses and also in the metaphors. Now finally, to stop, I said 3 elements. These discourses would not have this particular kind of importance for us even to talk about it, about hate speech. The problem of hate speech and the things in the mass media is they produce specific kinds of mental representations. One would say emotions, but emotions is not really the most important work. Yes, some people get angry, you know, about, oh, these immigrants in my neighborhood again get priority over housing. It happens when you don't have housing yourself. But most of the time, what people start consuming is a general picture of Turks, Moroccans, immigrants, Muslims, and so on. They construe a general negative picture of the others, what you call a prejudice. And suddenly, also, this may have some kind of ideological basis. And even that would not be so terrible. But these ideologies and these attitudes are precisely the basis of discriminatory action afterwards. So violence, killings, forms of discrimination, and other forms of discriminatory practices are precisely based on the shared ideologies and attitudes which we somehow construe slowly through these forms of public discourse. That's where the problem is. So if you want to do research, practical research, or action against discrimination, each of these elements can be critically examined. As a journalist, you can ask why I only have to go to this particular kind of source and not ask also the ethnic minority source itself. Why do I throw away this press release of a minority group? Why? Because my editor tells me I should be able to protest with my editor. That is also important information. Why is it that even after so many years of talking to journalists in many countries, they still write about waves of immigrants, although they know these particular kinds of metaphors have very negative influence, and so on and so on. So we talked about the law. Shall we forbid this kind of thing? it is very difficult and very dangerous to prohibit things, because we know that those in power will always abuse of all these laws. So if we somehow prohibit specific forms of discrimination of a minority group, you can be damn sure that the dominant groups will use that particular law to shut you up. All right? So it's very dangerous. So my recommendation, because I'm a professor, so I typically think that one of the solutions of the problem is in education. The only way we can change journalists is through a better education. So have an education in journalism, in the communication schools, also in letter schools, where we systematically show what happens with news and its influences. Systematically show what the kind of influences on the minds of people can be. So if they never learn about it, how can they, in actual practice in a positive way? So I think that a very systematic and explicit education of journalists is one of the ways to start. And which you can say you cannot educate politicians because, well, for many reasons. Should I talk about it? No, anyway. But let's say, maybe not politicians, because they may not be educated, well, whatever. But at least the citizens. I think it's absolutely crucial that also when the politicians are not minding their words and say all kinds of things, like former president, prime minister in Spain, Aznar, publicly in an international conference in Sevilla was branding immigrants as criminals, explicitly so, then no one in society who is a decent citizen and so on should accept that. And there should be a massive protest through the social media today, and they'll say, we don't want a president or prime minister who says these particular kind of things. I mean, we should be all critical discourse analysts. It's not difficult. Many of these things you can see for yourself and you should not accept. And there are many ways today to protest. We have many ways of accessing public discourse. And if you all become critical scholars and critical students and critical discourse analysts, you can see how these kinds of things work. And the only way things might change a little bit is to what they say in this kind of slogan, show to shame. You just show it. This is what you're saying, and you know what it means. If you analyze these particular kind of discourses. There's much more to say, but I have no time. Thank you.
Thank you for this engaging and dynamic talk, Professor Van Dijk. I wished it were you who taught to my students critical discourse analysis and not me. And now the floor is open to questions.
By the way, since not all people can talk, I have a website which you just put my name in Google and my website comes. And my website not only is my email address, and you can always send questions which have to do with your own work. And there's also a lot of bibliography there, and also many of my articles and books, which are the older ones. The newer ones I cannot put there because then my editor says, no way I will publish your book. So the older books are mostly there in English also. Well, mostly in English actually. And also lots of bibliography and other things. So lots of things and other links are there on my website to find, and also my email address. This, by the way, is easy because my name, Teun, at discourses, plural, discourses.org. Easy. Or my last name too. Van Dijk also works. Questions?
Yes, Professor.
Where are you?
Here yes. I am. Now you said that racism and sexism were the outcome for the quest of power. Yes. But I think that we should add another dimension to it, and that is the quest for survival, perhaps, or a deadly threat perception by a certain group, and therefore it becomes aggressive because it perceives a threat.
Men are you know, threatened by extinction by women? Could be, would be a good solution.
I'm not talking about sexism, but I'm talking about racism. If there is a certain group in a country which fears that their way of life is in jeopardy, and they fear that they won't be able to sustain their actual way of life because of immigration or because of whatever, and then they fear something, they perceive a threat, and then they become aggressive. If they wouldn't perceive a threat, perhaps they wouldn't be so aggressive.
Maybe.
Thank you.
I have a question. Can you give me one example, in the history of the world, where a dominant group, which was a majority, felt threatened by a tiny minority of immigrants because of their survival?
Hello? I can tell you that I was lately in Brussels for something at the European Parliament, and what they told me was that 35% of the population of Brussels were aliens, mainly Muslims, and 28% of them were Arabs.
Right.
And 1 out of every 2 newborn babies were not local people, to say so.
Same in Amsterdam.
Same in Amsterdam. So, do you think that these people don't fear that they won't be the majority anymore, and that they will be dictated a special way of life? I mean, perhaps you will tell me that I'm a racist. It's difficult because I'm part of a minority group in my own country. So, but I have antennas which are more sharp than the majority of the people because I'm a minority here myself, and I can understand sometimes the fear or the unease of people. Especially this is also the case with what we call in Turkey now white Turks, who were the ruling class in Turkey, but now who are the minority, and the normal minorities are not anymore in question because the white Turks are becoming a minority in Turkey themselves.
Right.
So there is indeed a threat perception. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes, but what you are saying, translated in what I was saying, is they are afraid to lose power, right? That's what I'm saying. That people are afraid, like many men. Well, survival presupposes that when they become a minority, then suddenly they will be exterminated. You know, like for example, women get 40% in the company, and the men should be afraid that they get exterminated.
They will not enjoy the same prerogatives or the same.
Exactly. Now we are talking. We are talking about privileges. We are talking about power and so on. Yes, of course. So if the majority group, wherever, of men or white people in Western Europe or wherever, suddenly lose all these prerogatives, then suddenly, I give you another example. I often go to Latin America and especially to Brazil. And in Brazil, the access to the university is mostly white people. Many black people never come to the university because of very bad secondary schools where poorer people. There are 50% nearly of the population, but in the university there is a tiny minority. So what did the government finally do? They said we are going to make quotas so that at least, like in the United States as well, we at least will admit so many percent of black people. And who was going to protest? We would usually think, oh, there's the right-wing racist group and so on. It was precisely the more liberal, progressive newspaper. That's reverse discrimination. Why? Because their interests of the white dominant elites was being threatened. Wherever you have this kind of thing, and you say it yourself, as soon as somehow power is being threatened, not the term of extermination only is so in very specific historic situation we all know about. But if you are talking about modern day questions of discrimination, it's mostly a question of losing privileges, being not number one, not getting a priority. I give another example. In my own old faculty, where I used to work in Amsterdam, in the faculty of letters, which now is called humanities, we were 60 full professors. You know how many men and how many women? There were only 5 women of 60 full professors. And 80% of the students were women. I don't say anymore.
One example. You know, the Turks living in Germany were blamed many times by the reasons that you explained perfectly. Here in Turkey, some Turks criticize Turks living in Germany for the same reasons. They say that, oh, they don't want to learn German language, so they deserve what is happening to them.
I know.
It has nothing to do with power relationship. They do not increase their power element. They do not increase their power capital by using this discourse. The reason is they really think that the Turks who went to Germany were uneducated peasants and etc., etc. So they are the white Turks who have the burden of civilizing Turkey and etc. So the Western civilization represents something better than the Eastern civilization, so on and so forth. You know, all those sometimes self-orientalization critiques, etc. So then emotions come into picture because they do not like these Turks. They do not like these Turks also in Turkey. They do not like these Turks also in Germany. So they are in coalition with German politicians to blame the Turks.
No, I don't. As you say, they don't like, etc. The example you are now giving is not a question of an example of racism, and so it's an example of classism. Yourself, your idea, what you show is they feel the ones of representing, they are the cultural elites of Turkey.
But they don't increase their capital.
Wait a minute. I mean, they are typically in exactly the same way as they describe about minority. They describe other Turks, not them, other Turks as uneducated and so on and so on. And therefore, of course, yes, so and so. I mean, what they are doing is legitimating the kind of discriminatory discourse and actions in Germany against them, which they will do in their own country in classist terms. Obviously, it has not, again, it's nothing personal, baby, and it's not a question of hate. They couldn't care less about them. But it's just a question of emphasizing class power. It is a question of those guys are not being educated. I mean, the kind of discourse I know from my country before I was born, by reading stuff, the kinds of things they said about social class, and Charlie, I'm sure, can say the same thing in England, the kinds of things we said about lower classes in Holland and in England, is exactly the same kind of thing you're now talking about, and the same kind of discourse, the same kind of attribution of course they are more criminal, of course they are not, you know, all this kind of thing. It is what your example confirms what I'm saying, I think.
If we find many lower class Turkish people who are blaming Turks not because of integrated into German society.
Yes, but and you say the Turks in this country are saying these kind of things.
No, lower class.
Yes.
Working class Turkish people living in Turkey sometimes can use the same discourse by saying that.
Yes, of course, but you know about.
So they are passive recipients of the discourse coming from the media.
I'm not saying passively, but I say if they don't read another kind of discourse in the media, where would they get an alternative discourse? I mean, the notion of indoctrination is a very powerful notion, and if they read all the time in newspaper that these stupid Turks and etc. in Germany and other countries do so and so and so, where would they get alternative information about that? I mean, the influence I'm talking about in the dominant newspapers and so on about minority immigrants and so on in Holland, in Spain, also here and so on. Where do you think these major ideologies come from? Again, it's not innate, it's learned. Where do they learn it? In public discourse. Who is responsible for public discourse? Also about these topics. If people, the only way people can resist dominant discourses is when they are systematically inconsistent with their own experiences. So, for example, a dominant newspaper cannot lie about being them out of a job. For example, about the economic crisis now in Spain. Everyone knows now in Spain what it means to be unemployed. No newspaper can change that. But they can, of course, find the explanation of this somewhere else. They can say, well, there is this economic crisis as if some kind of natural phenomenon and not blame, let's say, banks or whatever. So what you are saying, I think, but I would need more analysis of the data. But I think that what you say is an example of class discrimination in Turkey about other kinds of Turks. And that is a very general phenomenon.
No, there are many examples. Lower class, middle class Christian people who hate Jews. According to your theory, they learned it from the media. They learned it. No, they just learned it from the Bible. They just learned it from the.
I give you
priests.
another example. I did fieldwork with my students already in the 1980s, interviewing people in different kind of neighborhoods about immigrants, Turks, Moroccans, people from Suriname, black people from the Caribbean, and so on. And we found many established black Surinamese people saying negative things about these newcomers from Suriname. So again, this is another example. It has also economic reasons, because when there are more people coming, educated or not, somehow they are economically a threat for the position of those already established.
I agree, but I want to say that sometimes people do not increase their economic, political, social capital. They can be racist, they can be also anti-Semitic, they can be also in hatred towards the Muslim people without any reason of increasing their powers.
Okay.
This can be totally psychological, religious, whatever.
Yes, and my view is that this may happen. And I say it may happen on an individual basis. People do have, as I said in several examples, they are suddenly in specific kind of situation where they lose a job or whatever, and somehow the Jewish neighbor is rich or the Armenian neighbor is rich, whatever, and somehow the stereotypes influence them in such a way that they are going to blame this Jew or this Armenian person, like happens also in Netherlands. But it is an individual thing. Racism is a system of domination, is not an individual thing. It can have influence on individual people, but it's a collective phenomenon, and that's extremely important too. I don't deny what you say. I only don't think that is the major explanation of discrimination and racism and hate speech. It happens all the time. I mean, there are many examples of Jews hating themselves and so on, but they are anecdotal. It's not a systematic phenomenon. Yes, there is some psychological evidence of this kind of thing. It happens, but it's not the systematic explanation of domination and inequality. And I'm not a sociologist, but I think that few sociologists would be in disagreement with what I'm saying. Maybe some psychologists, and some do have an idea of the dynamics of developing ideologies, and there is some examples which are strange. For example, I also find in fieldwork that in the same family, in the same social situation, you would say everything socially the same. Someone becomes very racist and the other becomes very anti-racist in one family. And the question is why? That my theory would not be able to explain, and now we need individual psychology, we need Freud and the sofa and other things.
You told us something about use of metaphors in newspapers.
Yes.
Sometimes, or often actually, particularly in Europe, I experienced it in Germany, in Britain, and so on. Use of pictures of minorities and of some so-called foreigners and so on. They tell themselves stories. For example, when particularly use of pictures of Arab men from Afghanistan or so on. They are particularly, how do you call it? They use particularly ugly people. Let's say, I mean, ugly in terms of.
Attention, what you say, huh?
Of course, I know what I'm saying. In terms of for European. Let's say in
there are Arab
tastes.
stereotypes.
Yes.
Okay, there are stereotypes.
Yeah, the stereotypes of pictures are particularly different according to the topic they are writing in the newspaper
Yes,
or in the
yeah.
television. Can you say something about that?
Well, you already have said it. Of course, there is lots of work in discourse analysis, and modern discourse analysis today doesn't just look at words or text and so on. Discourse analysis today is multimodal discourse analysis much more, and more people also study systematically images, cartoons, websites, colors, many other typography. the analysis of discourse today is multimodal. It uses all kinds of media and also, of course, these stereotypes. And there are many studies today about stereotypes in movies, in images, and so on. And what you now say is a classic example of, let's say, anti-Arab stereotypes in pictures, in movies, and so on. Since many, many years we know about these kind of things. So that is standard analysis. The only thing is that the analysis of pictures today is not yet as sophisticated as very sophisticated discourse analysis, because it's not so easy. We have more than 2,000 years of tradition since Aristotle and so on of doing discourse and text analysis and drama analysis and so on, but very little systematic analysis of images. So it is quite primitive still, but there is kind of interesting work on multimodal discourse analysis today. One of the people I can recommend is a countryman of mine who works in Australia for a long time. It's called Teun van Dijk, which means lions in English. Teun van Dijk, who also studied in England, worked in Australia and so on. And he has written a book called Introduction to Social Semiotics. If you put that title in Google, you find his name, Introduction to Social Semiotics. And he's one of the people who has systematically described these particular kind of images in general. And if you just see prejudice, stereotype images, you get lots of, in Google Scholar, you find many, many examples, no problem. That's not a new thing, but it's interesting.
Is it working?
No, not yet.
Is it working? Buraya verir misiniz?
No, she's first.
Yes, it's working. Well, actually, maybe it is a little bit related to what you have been talking just before. Turks are prejudiced with Turks, and people who are prejudiced with themselves as well. First of all, I want to thank you with this enlightening speech of you and also Mr. Husband. It was really, really great. Thank you. Mr. Husband told about threat. You told about the blaming. These are the touching points for me. But my question comes from the point, yes, I can understand from the point of majority and from the point of domination, dominated society. The society dominates. But when it comes to the minority, you are the one blamed. You are the one who is considered as a threat. What happens in the mental model of the minority? Because the mental model and cognitive, socially cognitive ideas, socially cognitive shared ideas, you are in the society and you live in it as a woman. In the sexist ideas, what happens to the mental model in a woman in this blaming and in this being threat attack?
Okay. I am not specifically aware of lots of theoretical literature about the consequences of sexist discourse and behavior, other than that typically women get blamed, as you say, and there might be important psychological consequences. For the question of racist discourse in society, there is some literature in the United States about what the consequences are of being discriminated in the media, in everyday life, in the shop, wherever you go. Somehow you're treated in a different way. Of course, it has, first of all, it has an influence because the first thing we have is this mental model which is personal. And people, if it happens once, and another day with another mental model, and another mental model, and another mental model, what do people do? They generalize. Also, when they form prejudices. It's also when reading a dominant group member, when you read negative things about the others, you'll think, oh, suddenly Turks are like this, or Moroccans are like this, or Armenians are like this. People generalize from mental models. That's what you call an attitude. And finally, an ideology. Now, what happens by what you say, that's interesting, what happens with the minority group itself? Now, if you learn every day that your group is such, negative such each day again and again, that you have, unless you have a very resistant anti-dominant ideology and strategies, cognitive strategy, which you have to learn. And what was feminism all about? Precisely, it is establishing a different kind of counterpower, different counter-ideology, which we call feminism, and counter-attitudes about, but what they are construing as negative, that is just a prejudice, that is a way of learning to deal with them. But you first have to have a resistant form of ideology of resistance and a form of what they call consciousness. If you don't have that, typically you're going to blame yourself. And you're going to say, oh, they constantly say that I as a woman cannot do this, or I as a black person cannot do this, or I as a Turkish person cannot do that in Western Europe, then if you don't have a counter, for example, an anti-colonial or an anti-machista ideology, then it may affect your personality, and there is indeed situations where then minorities or women are going to blame themselves for not getting on top, or for not getting forward, or not getting access, and so on. It is very common, and it has been observed many times in psychology and so on. But my theoretical reply would be that is more common when they do not yet have formed some kind of ideology and attitudes, and therefore also mental models of resistance which can discount the dominant discourse. If I read a right-wing newspaper, you think automatically by reading it has an influence on me? No. Why? Because I have very strong anti-right-wing ideology which protects me from using the kind of reading the newspaper is suggesting. I am going to read it as a racist article and not as something which is true. But I only can do it when I have a counter-ideology which somehow interprets the data in a different way. You see? So again, it's a psychological thing. Yes, it may affect people, but you need a social thing. Women among each other, feminism, we're going to say that is a macho way of talk. Or that is a racist way of talk. Only then you can resist. That's how I would explain it.
One last question.
Hello. My question is, how can we make a difference? How can we make a difference between an other that is invisible, both spatially and being indifferent of, for example, and the other that is interacted, that is actively interacted for both the mainstream media and the person's mind, maybe. Can we make a difference?
It's a very abstract question, and I'm not sure that there are minorities which are totally invisible, but to an abstract question I can give an abstract answer, if you like. If the minority is there to interact with us, at least it's on the basis of everyday experience. If you have an Armenian neighbor or a Jewish neighbor or a Turkish neighbor in Holland and so on, you can at least, from this personal experience, can say, my experience is so-and-so. And people tell typical stories, and I've analyzed in many of my books these particular kind of stories since the beginning of 1980s, more than 30 years ago. So that is what people typically say, oh, my Turkish neighbor, and then it becomes a negative story. Or not, sometimes depends on the person. Because in the same neighborhood, people say, well, he did so-and-so, but we all do the same kind of thing, and people excuse the negative action of this neighbor and so on. And that is typically what you call a sort of anti-racist. People say you should not generalize from one example. So if you have everyday interaction with people, it happens a lot, you can say, my experience in this neighborhood is that generally speaking this happens so and so. At least people give some kind of evidence from everyday personal experience. But an invisible minority, you don't have interaction. I mean, it's not a ghost with whom you are interacting. So if the person is not there, how can you know about them? Only through dominant discourse. So people then are influenced not on the basis of everyday experiences in their own neighborhood, which is at least empirically based. They can lie, they can exaggerate, they can generalize, and they can make stereotypes about one or two examples. It happens all day. But in the other example of the invisible minority, and in fact, in many situations, in many countries, small minorities are practically invisible. People cannot even be distinguished. For example, Jewish people cannot necessarily always be distinguished from Turkish or Dutch people and so on. They are just Jewish because they have you cannot see in their face they are Jewish and so on. So I would say that in the situation of the invisible minorities, and there are other examples I can give, then the discourse is mostly about them. I gave you another example. Many years ago, suddenly there was a struggle, an ethnic struggle in Sri Lanka, you know, between a dominant group and a not-so-dominant group. And the not-so-dominant group came massively to Europe, and they also came, the Tamil refugees, they came to Europe. And suddenly they also came to Holland. And there were, I don't know, a few thousand. And in a country with 15 million people, you don't see a few thousand people. But then by coincidence, we were also doing interviewing in different neighborhoods of what people thought about the established minorities in Holland, Turks, Moroccans, people from the Caribbean, from Africa, and so on and so on. And the interesting thing was that suddenly all the people were talking about all these Tamil refugees, and no one had ever seen one. Which, in my view, was a laboratory experiment of social influence, although they did not have personal experience at all. The stereotypes and prejudices they have about Tamils were 100% construed by the mass media. There was no other explanation why they suddenly had a negative experience. They simply didn't know about Tamils otherwise than by the mass media. It was because people say very often the negative stereotypes they have about minorities because they have everyday negative experiences. That happens sometimes when there's lots of interaction every day, yes. But many times there is no so much interaction between majority. In this country, you cannot distinguish from the face from an Armenian of a non-Armenian or Jewish. No, they just all look the same. So you have to know. You have to know, see the last name or know where they go to church or to the temple or whatever, and so on. You don't know. So the invisibility is only there when it is a thing which is being construed, and is mostly construed by public discourse, not by interaction, because they are just looking the same kind of action and so on. So as a basis for racism and discrimination, we have to take into account the things you mentioned. How are people, what is their evidence? Some evidence is interactional, yes, but it's not always like that. And the fact that you always also have discrimination without any kind of interaction proves that the mass media, for example, are the major force of distributing racism and so on, but also, and I have to emphasize, not only racism, but also anti-racism, because you also are not born as an anti-racist or a feminist. You have to learn it first. So also that comes from different kind of columns, because the media don't always are the same. There's lots of variation and lots of contradiction. In the same newspaper, sometimes you have a racist article, and then next time you might have an article which is defending the minority or blaming the majority. It happens. It's not the majority of the articles, but the media are not homogeneous anywhere. So you also have to learn, and once you have this particular kind of, you think, oh, this columnist usually is representing my view and the other one is not. People react in a very different and diverse way on the mass media. All right, but it's a good question about this interaction thing.
Would you allow for a last question?
Of course, I have time. I can go on forever.
Evet.
Yes, we talked about Can you hear us? Yes, it's not a question, but it's something related to what Van Dijk has been saying. I just want to open a parenthesis and to make some additional remarks to get further information from him. Well, I want to talk about hate speech, or to put it in more correct terms, discrimination. Discrimination is expressed through public discourse, This is what has been said so far. I just would like to make an explanation here. Since the beginning of this panel, we did not talk about something, and I want to talk about that point, which I believe is an important detail. It's the concept of interest. This is unfortunately material concept nowadays. Well, it also has an immaterial dimension, but when we talk about interest, we can say that at the social scale or at the state scale, this concept of interest is the one that constitutes this hate speech notion or discrimination notion. Because if we're going to talk about racism, if we are talking about killing of Jewish people during the Second World War, when you take a look at Germany, it's because they were the ones who had the wealth, who had the money, who had the richness. There was an economic gap. So it was reaching such a point that the Jews were one by one massacred in that society. And alongside millions of Jews, there were also those who were not like the others in the community, in the society. All people were fearing this group. They were fearing this group in terms of the existence of the German society. So together with the rich Jewish people, all the weak people, homosexuals, the handicapped, they were also destroyed. Can you ask your question, asks the moderator. Well, as an academic, my question is the following. I think the presentation was a bit naive, and I also have this naive stance. I always tell my students to be objective, to be impartial and take a different perspective without prejudices. But sometimes, unfortunately, this is not the solution, because we're talking about this public discourse at a globalized scale, which goes in line with the interests of the CEOs, with the managers. So we teach the students something, but then it's useless. We teach the students something, but when our students starts working for a journal, for a newspaper, for a TV, they can't actually compete with the rules. We are running our time, so thank you very much. So I just wanted to emphasize the fact that this concept of interest is very important, and this is not something we can cope with. Thank you very much. Maybe Mr. Van Dijk would also like to make contributions to this, even with a couple of sentences. So thank you.
Power. If you have a theory of power, usually what is the basis of power are interests. People have power because they have land, because they have money, because they have capital, and so on. And as you say yourself, they are material interests. And then people also have power because they have more symbolic interests. They are famous, they have lots of knowledge, they have information like the mass media and so on. So the basis of power is all kinds of things. So if you challenge power, and if you analyze critically power, and so the question of maintaining power can be maintaining fame, maintaining the fact that we impose exams on our students is our way to guarantee symbolic powers and so on. We just don't give it away. A diploma, you know. In the same way, interest, the material interest, as you say, when it's material. So if that minority group is very powerful economically speaking, one way of doing this, and not only with the Jews in the Second World War, but many other situations in the world, many of the situations of discrimination precisely has to do with these dominant groups having not always objective, but sometimes also subjective perception of being richer. Like in this country, for example, Armenian people may be seen as richer, or Jewish people, like in many other countries, and it may be just a stereotype. So yes, you're right that part of the analysis of power is the basis of power, and one of the basis of power is also material, is interest, and one of the types of interest is material interest, and of course it can be envy, it can be attributing negative things, for example poverty in society, to the rich people. They can be blamed in many ways, and they also therefore can be exterminated, they can be stolen from, and so on, in the usual way we know from history. So yes, part of the analysis of domination and power is the question of interest, and sometimes it's also economic. Of course, yes.
Thank you, Professor Van Dijk. Before closing this session, there is a small note. Let me note you that the papers of Professor Charles Husband, the paper of Professor Charles Husband with supporting references will be available on the Hrant Dink website. I would like to thank once again to both our speakers for their insightful and stimulating talks, and I will like to thank to the audience. Thank you.